Okay, so when Christine was going through the discipline, there was a lot of information in there that actually is what we're going to cover now, and it was related to internal controls. So, what are internal controls? Well, these are policies and procedures that we use to ensure completeness, accuracy, authorization, and validity of data. So that's just a definition. But why do we have internal controls? Number one, we want to protect you. We want to protect innocent workers from accusations or from any kind of appearance that something not right is going on. So it's important to have these policies in place in writing so that it doesn't look like anything's going on, even if there isn't. Number two, to prevent and detect error. Having more people looking at, the invoices and the statements and the reports and everything, that helps improve accuracy, helps keep things from falling through the cracks and that kind of thing. So those are very important for that. And for the third one is to help deter fraud from happening. So it just kind of removes the opportunity and possibly some temptation that might be there if these controls weren't in place and it was something that could be done easily to take money from the church or those kinds of things that go on. Okay, so another definition of internal controls are methods and policies designed to prevent fraud, minimize errors, promote operating efficiency, and achieve compliance with established policies. Even more narrowly, procedures and policies designed to prevent or uncover errors and fraud. So this picture right here is what needs to be in place for fraud to occur. So there's three things generally that have to be present for fraud to occur in the church. So number one, there's pressure. Somebody who's working with the money has some major health problems and has bills they need to pay, and so they feel in the pressure to have the funds. Or maybe they have gambling or some kind of other addiction that requires large amounts of money to fund that, or even just feeling overworked and underpaid in their job. That, adding to the opportunities available, that person's trusted, they wouldn't do anything anyway, why do we need to monitor what they're doing? And then the internal controls aren't in place that would keep people accountable. And then the last part is rationalization. The person there, they have hospital bills to pay, and the money's sitting right there, and there's nobody going to know, and so they could justify it within themselves, saying, well, I'll pay it back. I'm only borrowing it. I'm not really stealing it. Or maybe the person just, is a bad apple, and they don't have that those ethics that would keep them from doing something like that. So when all three of these components are there, then you have a potential for something to happen with your church finances. And the only one that we can control is the opportunity. And so that's where internal controls come in, is removing that opportunity. So even if somebody is tempted and they are going to pay it back, but they're not able to because of the controls you have set up at your church. So this is a new slide from what we've had in the past. And this is a survey of churches from all different sizes, all different denominations. 13.2% reported a fraud within the last 5 years. And really, not all that fraud may have been reported, so we would think the number would probably be higher than 13%. And these are the findings that allowed the fraud to happen. So if any of these apply to your church, then you need to look at those policies and see what we can change to not enable somebody to do fraud with your finances. So there was no surprise audit or review of the bank reconciliation or any of the finances. There was no required vacations of staff. We are required to take at least one 5-day consecutive vacation because that makes it so that somebody else has to do your job while you're gone. If somebody is never taking a vacation, it may be because they're trying to hide what they're doing. And if they were forced to take a vacation, maybe that might have come to light. If criminal background checks or credit checks, especially people handling money, we check the credit for that reason. So if we're not doing those, that could enable fraud. The same person who takes the money to the bank is recording the deposit. What if they just took, $200 out of there and recorded it 200 less? Nobody would ever know the difference. There were no term limits for financial volunteers. So, the same person's been doing it for the last 20 years. Maybe it would be better to have where, you serve 4 years and then somebody else does it. If there's no financial expert on the finance committee, so, it would be helpful to have somebody experienced with accounting and maybe a CPA in your finance committee. If the same person is doing everything, they're writing the checks, they're depositing the cash, reconciling the bank accounts, they just do everything. One person does it all. Don't want to do that. Having related people on the finance committee or some kind of relationship within the financial staff, so people should be independent and not related for collusion reasons. You don't want people gathering together to do something, because one person would have a harder time, but if you got two people in two different positions that are working together, then it's a lot easier for something to be pulled off. And then not checking references when you're in your hiring process for bringing new people into your church. You want to make sure that those references are being checked from previous employers. Okay, so what we have for you in tab F is the local church minimum standards for your internal controls. As Christine mentioned earlier, the churches are required to have your internal control policies in writing, and in this tab is where that template is that she was referring to. Obviously this is a printed version, but if you were wanting to use this as the base of your policies, we have it available on our training materials website, where you can download it in a Word version and be able to copy and paste or delete, add things to it that you might need.
Will you repeat again what you said
The template?
Yes.
It's the second page in tab F. So the first page is the minimum standards, and then after that you should have one that says financial controls, policies, and procedures. That's the sample that we have available for you guys. Okay. So just to show you what's in the minimum standards, these were developed to help churches identify and implement basic internal controls to help prevent fraud, and just don't take these as an accusation that something is going on. Look at it as protection for your church so that something doesn't happen. These minimum standards should be increased for churches with higher volume of transactions, but should not be compromised for churches with lower volumes. All local churches are expected to meet these minimum standards. So you could have even higher controls in place, but don't skimp on these controls. Okay, so for the authorization, that is covered under the receipts and disbursement section. The last 6 bullet points have to do with the authorization. So like we said, having these guidelines in writing, approved by the finance committee. Program leaders with authority by the finance committee should be authorizing the expenses, not the treasurer. So the person writing the checks should not be the one approving that expense to be paid. Make sure you're requiring invoices for all the payments from all accounts. There is an exception if you have in your policy where routine monthly expenses can just be paid without having to have that particular invoice signed off on, such as a mortgage or the light bill or anything like that. So those routine expenses could be kind of approved all at one time for the year. But anything else that's not routine definitely needs to have approval from that program area. Okay. And lastly, have 2 people listed as authorized signatures on all accounts. And that just is, in case that person becomes unavailable for whatever reason, if they're out of town or they're not with us anymore, anything like that, then there's always somebody else that can access those funds. Okay. For record keeping, the financial secretary has the responsibility for recording the offering count details. So the counting team is counting the money, and the financial secretary is the one recording the deposit. Offering totals should be given to the treasurer or financial secretary to record the deposit. Financial secretary's deposit log should be compared to the bank statement to verify deposits. So what the financial secretary is recording in their log needs to match up with the deposit list on the bank statement. And that should be looked at to make sure that that's happening. Okay. And lastly, we have custody. The counting team, 2 unrelated people, counting, offering, and document the totals. That should not be the treasurer and not the secretary. And the offering should be deposited the same or next business day, so that those checks are cashed immediately. That cash is not able to be stolen or lost or anything like that. We need to get it into the bank as soon as possible. Okay. On the back of that first page, we get into talking about reporting and review. So this is where we're looking at the bank reconciliations. So yes, those need to be reconciled every month, and then somebody else needs to be looking at those reconciliation and indicating that they've reviewed it. So just because it's done, that you don't stop there. You want to have somebody else who's unrelated look at those and make sure that everything looks right. And then at least twice a year, you want to have someone other than the treasurer or the secretary reviewing the invoices and checks and everything that go with those bank recs. And then quarterly, the treasurer should be making detailed reports of the budget and designated fund activities to the finance committee. So you want to be hearing from your treasurer at least quarterly how things are going. And then getting into the audit. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. How many and which groups in the church does the conference recommend have a separate checking account? Like United Methodist men, United Methodist women, those kinds of groups.
Sometimes there's Sunday school classes where there are other groups that have sprung up within the church for perhaps a benevolent purpose.
And the question was, does the conference have a recommendation for how many groups can have checking accounts in the local church? And we don't. It is the authority of the finance committee at each local church to set those provisions. Now, obviously, we recommend that the finance committee spend time making sure that it makes sense to have that many, and that they understand that every checking account has the same internal control provisions. So if you have a Sunday school class that has a checking account, then it's the same thing about a separate person deposits, a separate person writes the checks, a separate person reviews the bank account. Every internal control rule applies to every single account. You could have those consolidated as long as the balances can be tracked properly, but the finance committee is the one responsible for making sure all the internal controls are in place around every account, and that they are all included in the church audit, because every single account from the local church should be in the audit. Now, United Methodist women can have their own checking account, and that's not really up to the finance committee. That is up to United Methodist women. They can choose to have their funding included and the church treasurer do that, but they are not required to by the local church finance committee. But for everyone else, the finance committee is the one that makes the decision what works best in your church. But all the internal controls apply to every single account.
Are United Methodist men in the same category as the women?
The question was the actual question was, are the United Methodist men in the same category as United Methodist women? The way that I will answer that question is that the United Methodist men accounts are not called for in the Book of Discipline to have the provision that they be separate. So United Methodist men would fall under the direction there of the finance committee as a ministry of the church. United Methodist Women has particular language in the Book of Discipline that allows that, they're not considered local church funds. They are considered to be owned by the unit, and that's in the Book of Discipline that way.
About transfers between accounts, for example, we have a separate account that has what do they call it? They call it a maintenance fund. And there's a tradition of transferring from the general fund to that fund every year, but then there's no paper trail.
There's no paper trail on how it's spent or on how it's transferred?
It's not currently spent, it's accumulating.
Okay. So you would just want to have some kind of documentation of who authorized that transfer to be done. So if it's the finance committee, like just have some kind of documentation with somebody's signature authorized to do that, saying this is the amount that we've approved to move over to this other account for future maintenance needs.
Great, thank you.
I have a point of clarification on United Methodist Men and their standing and what they can and cannot do and what's expected of them.
The question that was asked is out of my pay grade. Because the question that was asked was clarification on the United Methodist Men and what is expected of them and what is their responsibility and all of that. What I can answer on that question is that the United Methodist Men are considered to be a program of the church, and so if they have their own checking account, then that account does have to be included in the local church audit, which brings it under the oversight of the finance committee. So that is in the Book of Discipline. It is a local church ministry. The United Methodist Women is in the Book of Discipline as their funds belonging to their unit.
Question. Just go ahead.
How does the answer to transferring from like general fund to maintenance fund align with the policy that funds designated for fund be used only for that?
Well, I would think that if they're transferring it to a maintenance fund, it was probably part of the budget. You wouldn't want to take something that was designated for, an advanced special and move it over to the maintenance fund. But if they've allowed in the budget for there to be a certain amount for maintenance, and they just transfer it over to that other account so that it's separated from everything else, then that's still using it as it was directed for.
A couple questions. Going back to United Methodist Men. I understand basically what you were saying, is that if we had a separate checking account, it did not necessarily have to be the same checking account as the general fund is in, but it still comes up under the overall coverage of reporting that to an audit program. We can't have them.
Right.
Now, another part is in terms of United Methodist Women and United Methodist Men. At the end of the day, when you look in the congregation, they're nothing but mostly women that have survived men. I understand why it was put in place, and that's because it was the thing about power. It was inclusiveness, so to speak. I understand that part is why Methodist women were set up to be a little different, and that they could do things a little different. But having said that, I think I understand why United Methodist Men can have an account, but it has to be looked at by the church and as a part of doing business and of the various expenditures and stuff like that.
Let me help you out. The local discipline, page 190, section 256, number 1, you go to H and 1. The United Methodist Men unit may have their own bank accounts. 2, the United Methodist Men unit shall have an annual financial audit. That's the discipline. They can have both, but they have to be under the control of the what's name. So they can't have their own bank account.
That's
That
correct.
was newly installed since the 2008 version, this is the 2012 version.
And I guess my
So
question,
what he was pointing out was in the book of discipline, it says they can have their own bank account, which they can. They can, but they need to have that included and have an audit and all the same provisions apply. And let's talk about United Methodist Men at lunch, because we do need to move on so we can cover all of our materials. So as soon as we break for lunch, everybody else get their food, and if you want to talk about United Methodist Men, come up here and we're going to. Okay, go.
Okay. We're not going to lunch just yet. All right, so about the audit, so all accounts need to be included, which would include the Methodist men, may not include the women, but it could, but they're the only ones that have that provision where it could be outside of the audit. As you can see on this slide, everything needs to be included. You know, audit and evaluation, they mean different things to different people, which is why we have in tab G is the local church audit guide. So at a minimum, every year, every church should be having an audit or an evaluation in as much detail as the documentation in tab G. When you start getting into having a larger budget and your church has $500,000 or more in disbursements every year, then an actual external audit by a CPA would need to be done at least every 3 years. Now, in those years in between, you know, you have an audit year 1, year 2, and 3, you still need to be doing that annual evaluation with the local church audit guide, but you would not necessarily have to pay an outside firm to come in every year and do an official audit. However, if your church is having a $1 million budget with $1 million of disbursements or more, then you do need to have an actual CPA audit done every year. And that's just to protect you. With that much money coming in and out, you know, you want a professional coming in and looking at those transactions. The last section on here, the other general requirements, are just kind of some miscellaneous recommendations having to do with church property, having a list of all your property for insurance purposes, a list of what's in the safety deposit box, making sure that the authority on that is up to date so that you have somebody who can go to the bank and actually get in the deposit box, and then that your computer records are being backed up with password protection and all the stuff. That's really important, and it keeps getting more and more important that you have your records safe from, you know, hackers and all that kind of stuff. So, and then lastly, the segregation of duties. Having more than just 1 or 2 people working on the different parts of with your finances is very important, so that you know, they're not handling everything and having that opportunity to commit fraud. Okay. And as we turn over to tab G, this is, you know, we talked about this a little bit just now with the local church audit. This is a resource for you to take. The first half of what's in there is some answers to some frequently asked questions, which we'll go over real quick here before lunch. And then there's an actual guide that kind of walks you through the process of doing the audit and the evaluation of your church records. So you can have someone who isn't necessarily a CPA do the evaluation, and this is a good tool for them to have to perform that. So looking through the frequently asked questions document, on page 1, it just goes through, well, what is an audit? An audit is an independent evaluation of the financial records and reports and the internal controls of the church. And again, it's not a symbol of distrust. It's just an independent evaluation, and it's for your protection. Who can do an audit? So the person needs to be independent, meaning they're not working with the finances in your church to begin with. They need to be qualified, having knowledge of how, you know, disbursements and deposits and how all that works needs to be there. But they don't necessarily need to be a CPA who, you know, does this for a living. We just added that audit referral page, so there's one referral on there right now. So if you guys could go to that page and fill out the little form and refer other firms or individuals that you know of that do a good job, tell us what area you're in, and I'll put those up on the website. Because I do get calls saying, who should I have audit my books? I don't have anybody. Your recommendations, I think, would go a long way to helping those churches that aren't sure where to start. Okay. So on page 3, we talk about restricted gifts and how they should be spent. And again, it just comes down to if somebody gives money for a certain reason and you've accepted that gift, you have the obligation to spend that gift in the way that they designated when they gave that to you. So we do get questions about there's money left over for buying a new piano, and what do we do with it? So it's very important that you have those records to be able to know who gave that money, so that you can go back to the person and see, can we spend this a different way since we've fulfilled that need? Okay. So we'll let you go through these questions that we've got on here. There's a lot of helpful information. This guide was just updated last year, so it's very current as far as the kind of questions that we've been getting and that kind of thing. And the last question is this is a lot of work. Is this required even for small churches? And the answer is yes. Every church should be having this review done every year with at least much detail as the local church audit guide. All right, I think we're going to let Reggie come up and talk a little bit.
Do you have any questions about internal controls and the audit guide? Anything that Jennifer has gone over so far? Jen?
What's your recommendation as far as the pastor being authorized by the finance committee to be approving expenditures for payment?
The question was, what is our recommendation for the pastor being approved by the finance committee to approve expenditures? It is our recommendation that the pastor would not be involved in that, and that there would be budget managers, those who are responsible for that program, that would be approved by the finance committee to do that. Sometimes in small churches that's difficult. People work, they're not around when something needs to be paid, but we believe there could be a system set in place so that someone could be responsible for approving those. That would not be the pastor. It just becomes a little bit difficult and a little bit uncomfortable, quite frankly, that we've seen in our experience for some pastors when they're in that position, and particularly around when there could be disagreement over spending a certain amount of money one way or another, and it makes it a little bit difficult. So we recommend that it's someone other than the pastor for that. It's not required by the Book of Discipline that it be that way, but it's been our observation that sometimes that can become a little bit sticky for the pastor.
Doesn't the pastor, by discipline requirement, have an obligation to be involved in the oversight of this?
The question was, doesn't the pastor have an obligation to be involved in the oversight? And they do have oversight over all the areas of the church, so they do have responsibility for that, but that does not necessarily require that they be the one that approve the expenditure in the church. They can give oversight in other ways for the financial function of the church without it being them being the one making that decision.
Nominate committee, stack that.
Another questions?
Our church has a Mother's Morning Out program that is closing in May. And it has $50 million balance that probably will not be used. Your donation for this program. What would your recommendation be to do with those funds? You can be, here's what we'd like to do. The overseer of that program would like for the funds to be placed in a maintenance fund for the playground. And could we do that as administrative council approves that, or do we have to go back to every single person that donated?
The question was about, in particular, when money has been raised for, and there are restrictions placed on that money, what happens when that program ends and there's money left over? In this particular case, it's dealing with the Mother's Morning Out program that's ended. There'll be a small balance that's left, and what do you do with that money? Who can approve that? And we'll talk more about your situation in particular, but in general, you have to go back and look at how was the money raised. Do you have a gift acceptance policy at your church that says, after we've met the restrictions, then the money goes here or there? It depends on how it's documented at your church, what you're going to do, and when you advertise this particular campaign where you are raising money, did you say at that time? You've got to go back and look at the documentation and see what was said. If nothing was said, then that's when it becomes a little more particular. And have you had conversations in the church? Have you given notice that this money could be left and that's what to do? So it depends very much on the particulars of a situation, and we'll talk more about yours at lunch. But in general, the first step is go back and see what documentation you have. Do you have a written policy about that? What does that say? And then to learn, if you don't have a written policy, this is a great time to put one in place, because that way when this happens again, you'll learn from this and you'll have a policy in place for what you're going to do next time. So thank you, Jennifer.